Freezing again, isn't it? So frustrated. Countdown are freezing on me. I'm gonna restart it. I think on YouTube it'll keep going. Right? Is YouTube having these problems? All right. YouTube will just keep going in the same place. Facebook will have a restart. Unless maybe it worked itself out. Did it work itself out? I thought it was just my phone. What about now? It seems to be going better. Is it going better? Let me know. Just wait a minute. I hate restarting. But maybe it worked itself out. It seems to be smooth. There's a delay when people answer me. I know that, so I'm just waiting a little bit. But it seems to have worked itself out, right? Right? What do we think? From the moment that I waved both arms like this. Are we getting good sound and picture? Barbara says no sound, but I don't think sound is actually the issue. So if you're not getting sound, that might be on you. Yeah, it seems okay now. All right, let's keep going. I hate tech difficulties. Okay, let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us? So we're struggling to engage on a Wednesday evening. Melissa in Great Neck, Yehuda in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Renee in Indiana, Nancy in North Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Shandor in the Bronx, Ruth in Kentucky, Guy in Ohio, Bella in Florida, David in Indiana, Christina in Texas, Clarissa says Erev Tov, Tom in PA, Michelle in Oklahoma, Karen's in Northern California, Barbara's in Atlanta, Steven is in New Hampshire, Lucy's in Minnesota, Ari in Miami, Bill in mid-Missouri, David checking in with everybody. All right, looks like we are rolling now. Looking good. Awesome. Shalom Aleichem to you. Aleichem Shalom to you, Lynn. Good. All right. Here we go. And over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Virginia, Yitzhak in Kansas City. And I think it's been worked out now, right? The audio seems to be going. Hopefully we're all good. Okay. Sound is low. That's interesting. Blah, 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 blah. Maybe that'll help a little. Okay. I think we're rolling. Let me know if anything terrible comes up. Nina's still away, delivering our daughter to college, so I'm on my own. I'll scan the comments for questions toward the end of class. Our daf is page 49 here in Tractate Kesubos. the 15th volume of the Talmud. Pardon me. We are in chapter 4, today completing our discussion of Mishnah number 5, opening Mishnah number 6. And now we're finally getting into the obligations and the rights of the spouses in a marriage. But as we kind of ease our way into what we thought would be the main subject of this tractate, which is about the laws of marriage contracts, we're still sort of tracking the journey of a daughter from her father's house into her husband's domain. The ancient society is very patriarchal. Of course, there were some independent women and incredibly talented women, but generally speaking, women were dependent first on their fathers and then on their husbands for livelihood, and therefore those men had absolute obligations to sustain the daughter, to sustain the wife, etc. And then we've been looking at when does that responsibility transfer from the father to the husband, and its implications for the laws of authority, for nullifying vows, for sustenance, for inheritance, etc. We pick this up at the bottom of page 48b. So the sage taught in a baraisa, if the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers, right? So we were looking at when authority transfers from one household to the other, and that's why they were talking about the father's messengers and the husband's messengers, right? So the father of a betrothed daughter is going to not attend the wedding himself. He can't go, and he's going to send his daughter with his own messengers. Well, then she's still in her father's household. Right? And then if at a certain point the father's messengers, sort of hand her off to the husband's messengers who are going to bring her to the husband's house, where she's going to enter the wedding canopy and become married, to him complete the marriage process that began with betrothal. So it's at that handoff that also the authority from the father gets handed off to the husband. So what are the implications of this in various areas of the law? So if the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers, and she subsequently committed adultery, right? So we're still a little bit looking at this subject, but it's not so much because we're so fascinated with the punishment for adultery. Really, we're looking at the law of adultery and its associated death penalty to look at that transfer of authority. So if the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers and then she committed adultery, right? So she's betrothed. Is she fully married? And what we're seeing is there's a betrothed young woman who commits adultery. It's adultery because she's betrothed, right? She hasn't fully married the man to whom she's betrothed, but if they break it up, she needs a bill of divorce. And if she sleeps with another man while she's betrothed, then she has committed adultery. However, a woman who commits adultery in a state of betrothal has a different death penalty than a woman who commits adultery in a state of marriage. It's a young woman in a state of betrothal. So the young woman in a state of betrothal, if she commits adultery, death penalty by stoning. Grown woman married to her husband commits adultery, death penalty, but by strangulation, right? Right, was that it? Stoning versus strangulation. So it's stoning in her father's house, strangulation when she's a grown woman. So we're tracking, which death penalty is it, just to better understand, has she left the domain of her father and entered the domain of her husband? So once the father has delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers, and if she then commits adultery, that's why she's sentenced to strangulation, the punishment of a married woman who commits adultery, rather than stoning, which is the punishment of a betrothed woman who commits adultery. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? And Rabbi Ami Bar Chama said that the verse states, in the context of the command to stone a young woman who commits adultery during betrothal, Deuteronomy 22:21, to play the whore in her father's house. which excludes a case when the father has delivered her to the husband's messengers, meaning she is no longer living in her father's house. So the Gemara raises a difficulty, but one can say that the verse is excluding a case where she has entered the wedding canopy, but she has not yet had intercourse. Whereas if her father has merely delivered her to the husband's messengers, she is still considered to have sinned in his house and is punishable by stoning like any other betrothed woman. Excuse me. So in answer to this question, Rava said the verse cannot be excluding that case, as Ami said to me that the case where she already entered the wedding canopy is not derived by inference from that verse. It is explicitly written in the following verse. If there is a young woman who is a virgin betrothed to a man, but she's never been married before, that's why she's assumed to be a virgin. She's betrothed, so she hasn't yet slept with her husband, so she's still a virgin. The terminology of the verse indicates that it applies to a young woman and not to a grown woman, to a virgin and not to a non-virgin, and to a betrothed woman and not to a married woman. In the former cases, the death penalty for adultery would be stoning. In the latter cases, the death penalty for adultery would be strangulation. So the Gemara analyzes this statement. What is the meaning of the term a married woman in this context? If we say that she is actually married and has already engaged in intercourse with her husband, this ruling is the same as the previous one, that she must be a virgin and not a non-virgin. Rather, is it not the case that it is referring to a woman who has entered the wedding canopy, but she has not yet had intercourse with her husband? And yet, if she committed adultery at this stage, she is sentenced to strangulation, like a grown woman who's no longer a virgin, who is married and not just betrothed. So consequently, the other verse cited by Rabbi Ami Bar Chama cannot be referring to this case. Now we're on 49a. So the Gemara asks another question, but say that in a case where she returns to her father's house, she returns to the previous matter, i.e. her former status, as though she had never left her father's authority. Maybe she got betrothed to a man and they broke off the betrothal. So for sure she's still in her father's domain. Could it be that if she gets married and then divorced and returns to her father's house, that she would still be considered like a young woman living in her father's house, like she was before she was married? I think we've seen no. Once she's married, she's considered a grown woman, even if she returns to her father's house. But say in the case where she returns to her father's house, she returns to the previous matter. And Rav has said that question has already been resolved by the Tana of the school of Rabbi Yishmael. And this is what the Tana of the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. But the vow of a widow or of a divorcee, everything which she has bound her soul, shall stand against her. Right? So a daughter who makes a vow, she can have her vow nullified by her father. A wife who makes a vow, she can have her vow nullified by her husband. A man who makes a vow doesn't have the option to go to his father or his wife to have that vow nullified. The only way for him to have it nullified is to go to a sage, right, a rabbinic court, and explain, that he never would have undertaken that vow if he had known what the implications were. And then, if he can prove that to the satisfaction of the sage can nullify his vow. Otherwise, he must fulfill the terms of his vow. And a woman who is divorced or widowed stands in the same place as any man. She doesn't have a husband, and she no longer can return to her father's house to have her vow nullified. She no longer has that advantage. It's an advantage to have someone nearby who can nullify your vows. Right. So, but if she is, but the vow of a widow or a divorcee, it shall stand against her. So what is the meaning of the verse that states this? Is it not already known that if she is widowed or divorced, she has already been removed from the category of one under the authority of her father, and she has likewise been removed from the category of one under the authority of her husband, who then could possibly nullify her vows? Rather, this is referring to a case where the father delivered his daughter to the husband's messengers, or where the father's messengers delivered her to the husband's messengers, and she was widowed or divorced on the way to the wedding canopy. They broke off the betrothal. So how do I consider her? Is she a member of her father's house or a member of her husband's house? Her status is entirely unclear. So rather, this verse comes to tell you, since she has left her father's domain for a short time, her father is no longer able to nullify her vows, as she is considered a widow or a divorcee in all regards. Even though she was never fully married, even though she just came from betrothal. When she becomes a widow or a divorcee from betrothal, she can no longer be considered under her father's authority. And the same applies to the issue at hand. She retains the status of a married woman even if she returns to her father's house. Rav Papa said, we too learn this principle in a Mishnah. And now, we've just been talking about, well, the woman who's in her father's house who commits adultery, the punishment is stoning. And the woman who commits adultery while in her husband's house, her punishment is strangulation. Lest you think that this harshly patriarchal society was only willing to stone or strangle women, the man who commits adultery with the young woman who's only betrothed, or with a grown woman who is a wife, right? The Jewish man who commits adultery with these women has the same punishment as the women do. Rav Papa said, we too learn this principle in a Mishnah. See Sanhedrin 66b. One who has intercourse with a young woman betrothed to another man is liable to stoning only if she is a virgin, a young woman betrothed and she is in her father's house. Otherwise, it would be strangulation. The Gemara analyzes this Mishnah. Granted, the term young woman indicates that this punishment does not apply if she is a grown woman. Similarly, this punishment applies only if she is a virgin, but not if she is a non-virgin, and only if she is betrothed, but not if she is married, fully married. However, when the Mishnah states that she is in her father's house, what does the phrase come to exclude? Does it not serve to exclude a case when the father delivered her to the husband's messengers, indicating that in such a case, the punishment of stoning no longer applies? And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, we too learn this principle in another Mishnah in Sanhedrin 89a, with regard to one who has intercourse with a married woman. Once she has entered her husband's authority for marriage, even though she has not had intercourse with him, the one who has intercourse with her and commits adultery, he is punished by strangulation, which is the punishment for adultery with a married woman. And it is clear that this law applies if she merely entered the husband's authority for the purpose of marriage, even if they have not yet stood under the wedding canopy or consummated the marriage. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Here comes Mishnah number 6. A father is not obligated to provide his daughter's sustenance. This exposition was expounded by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah before the sages in the vineyard of Yavne. Since the sages instituted that after the father's death, the sons inherit the sum of money specified in their mother's marriage contract, and the daughters are sustained from their father's estate, these two laws are equated. Just as the sons inherit only after their father dies and not during his lifetime, so too the daughters are sustained from his property only after their father's death, meaning that the father is not obligated to sustain his daughters while he is still alive. Really? Is that the case? No, that's not the case. And now we're going to learn the difference between an obligation and a mitzvah and the real world, right? In all these, stoning and strangulation and the law of the rapist and the seducer, we were constantly examining the principles to understand, what are the liminal areas, when do we run up against a limit and authority changes from one household to another, etc. But we rarely talked about real-world incidents. In the discussion of this Mishnah, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of real-world incidents. And then we're going to say, are the sages really holding that if a father is a jackass who says, you know what, man, I don't feel like working and I don't feel like earning and I don't feel like providing for my children, that he can get away with that? Answer, no, they're not going to let him get away with that. And let's see how it works out. Here's the Gemara. With regard to the Mishnah's statement that a father is not obligated to provide his daughter's sustenance, the Gemara infers it is with regard to providing his daughter's sustenance that he is not obligated. But with regard to providing his son's sustenance, he is obligated. Furthermore, with regard to his daughter, also there is no obligation, and therefore the court cannot compel him to provide sustenance for his daughter, but there is a mitzvah for him to do so. Now the two words here are mitzvah. What is mitzvah? Very often people use the word mitzvah when they bring it into English and the conversation. Do a mitzvah. Do a good thing. Go, pick up your friend from the airport. And the word mitzvah there is being translated poorly as good deed. A mitzvah is not a good deed. The word mitzvah means commandment, right? A mitzvah is something that God commands you to do. Sometimes it's a mitzvah not because God directly spoke in the Torah and said, thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do this, but the sages issued a rabbinic decree based on a mitzvah that was in the Torah, but that, in an area that wasn't covered in the Torah, and then the rabbinic decree comes along and says you must do this or you can't do that, right? And that's mitzvah. Chayev is obligated, right? An obligation. So obligated is interesting, and here they're going to make this distinction like, well, obligated means you must do it, like you must sustain your child. Mitzvah seems to be like it's appropriate to do it. It's proper to do it. But that's not what mitzvah means. So what's going on here? Now, one way to maybe understand this is the Torah says it is a mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird when you take an egg from the nest. How many people in this class have ever fulfilled that mitzvah? It's very difficult mitzvah to fulfill. We just don't commonly, come across a bird's nest with the mother sitting on the eggs and shoo her away and take the egg. Like, why would we do that unless we needed the egg to eat it? Like, people don't do this. Except that, because it is a mitzvah in the Torah, some people will actually go out of their way to find a way to perform that mitzvah. But it's quite difficult to do it and do it appropriately. If you're ever looking to fulfill that mitzvah, you actually have to read up about it and get the full idea of the law before you go do it. But at any rate, it's a commandment in the Torah, but you're not really obligated to go find or create a situation where you can fulfill it, right? So maybe that's how this distinction is being drawn. Right? It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment, but you're not necessarily in a situation where you're going to be able to fulfill it. Whereas an obligation, you're obliged, right? If you have children, you're obliged to take care of them, to sustain them, to educate them. There's a whole bunch of things you're obligated to do. So let's see how they're drawing this distinction in this discussion, right? So there's no obligation to sustain the daughter, meaning that the court is not going to step in when this guy is not supporting his daughter and seize his estate and pull money out of it to give to her. But the man is commanded, right? He has a mitzvah that he is able to fulfill when he sustains his children. Now, with this interpretation in mind, whose opinion is expressed in our Mishna that says he's not obligated? If it is not Rabbi Meir, nor Rabbi Yehuda, nor Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Presumably, these three major sages all say a father is obligated to sustain his daughter. As it is taught in the Baraisa, it is a mitzvah to sustain daughters, and the same applies by a Kal v'chomer inference to sons who are engaged in the study of Torah. Meaning, you're commanded to sustain your daughter, to make sure she's fed and clothed and sheltered, then all the more so, and your daughters are not commanded to study Torah, so all the more so you would have to feed and clothe and shelter your sons who are commanded to learn Torah. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you got it backwards. It is a mitzvah to sustain your sons, and all the more so you must sustain your daughters due to the dishonor they will suffer if they are forced to go around begging. Right? It's a mitzvah to sustain your sons so that they will not have to go around begging for charity, and all the more so you must sustain your daughters, because it would be an even bigger disgrace if your daughters had to go around begging for charity. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, it is an obligation to sustain the daughters after their father's death. However, during their father's lifetime, both these and those, sons and daughters alike, are not sustained, meaning that the court will go in and seize the assets and redistribute. The Gemara restates its question. Whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah? If you say it is Rabbi Meir, didn't he say that providing sustenance even to one's sons is merely a mitzvah, not an obligation? You fulfill a Torah commandment when you do it, but the court's not going to step in and make you fulfill that commandment the way they would for an obligation. So whose opinion is expressed by the Mishnah? If you say it's Rabbi Meir, didn't he say that providing sustenance even to one's sons is merely a mitzvah, not an obligation? If the Mishnah expresses the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, didn't he say that providing sustenance to one's sons is also a mitzvah, not an obligation? And if it is Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, according to his opinion, there is not even a mitzvah to provide sustenance for one's daughters. Consequently, none of the opinions of the Tanaim of the Baraisa fits the ruling of the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers that the Mishnah can be explained in several different ways. If you wish, say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and if you wish, say that it follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and if you wish, you can even say it follows the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baraka, because you've interpreted it wrong until now. Let's see how this works. So the Gemara says, if you wish, say that our Mishnah, which says you're a father not obligated to sustain his daughter, is in accordance with Rabbi Meir. And this is what he said in the Mishnah. A father is not obligated to provide his daughter's sustenance, and the same is true with regard to providing sustenance for his son. This indicates that there is a mitzvah, though not an obligation, to provide for his daughter, and by the Kal V'chomer inference, it is also a mitzvah with regard to his sons. And the reason that the Mishnah teaches only the case of his daughter, that he's not obligated, but it is a mitzvah, and omitted any mention of sons, is not because a father is obligated to feed his sons. Rather, it teaches us like this, that even with regard to his daughter, there is no obligation to provide her sustenance. However, there is a mitzvah to do so. Now we're on 49b. And if you wish, say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and this is what he said in the Mishnah: a father is not obligated to provide sustenance for his daughter, and all the more so he is not duty-bound to provide for his son. It may be inferred from here that there is at least a mitzvah with regard to a son, and the same applies by Kal V'chomer inference to the daughters. And the reason that the Mishnah teaches the case of his daughter is because it teaches us like this, that even with regard to his daughter, there is no obligation, despite the mitzvah, to guard her from dishonor. And if you wish, say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, and this is what he said: a father is not obligated to provide sustenance for his daughter, and the same is true with regard to providing for his son, and the same is true with regard to a mitzvah. There's not even a mitzvah to feed either one's sons or daughters, but since the Tana wanted to say with regard to daughters that after their father's death there is an obligation to sustain them from his estate, right? From the estate, the court will step in, seize assets from the estate, and make sure that the daughter is sustained. So consequently, it is incorrect to infer from here that there is a mitzvah to sustain them despite the lack of obligation. Rather, the Tana means that there is no obligation and not even a mitzvah to do so. So that's fear. That's theory. Right? That's theory based on the law that, okay, the court will step in, seize the assets of the father after he dies to make sure that the daughter is provided for, since she's not an inheritor like the brother. But what happens in the real world? So Rabbi Ilya said that Reish Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda bar Chanina, in Usha, right? Usha in Babylonia, the sages instituted that a man should sustain his sons and daughters when they are minors. And the dilemma was raised before the sages. Is the law in accordance with his opinion, or is the law not in accordance with his opinion? Must a man feed his young children in practice or not? And the Gemara answers, come in here. When they would come before Rav Yehuda to complain about a father who refused to sustain his children, a deadbeat dad, Rav Yehuda would say to them, the jackal bears offspring and casts the obligation to feed them on the residents of the town? Even a jackal feeds its young, and it is certainly proper for a father to support his children. When they would come before Rav Chisda to register a similar complaint, he would say to them, turn over a mortar for him to stand on in public and proclaim about himself. This is like putting someone in the stocks, right? They would make him stand on a platform in public and say to passersby, the raven wants to care for its sons, and yet this man, talking about himself, does not want to support his sons. And the Gemara questions this statement. Does the raven want to feed its sons? But isn't it written in Psalm 147? He gives to the beast its food, to the young ravens that cry. And this verse indicates that the parents of young ravens do not feed them. And the Gemara responds, oh, this is not difficult, as in this case it is referring to white ravens, and in that case it is referring to black ones. There are different types of ravens, some of which feed their young and some of which do not. So the Gemara further relates, when an incident of this kind would come before Rava, he would say to the father, is it satisfactory to you that your sons are sustained through charity? All these incidents prove that the law is not in accordance with the enactment of Usha. Although these sages stated forcefully that it is proper for a father to support his children, they did not force him to do so by the authority of the court, right? They didn't seize his assets and redistribute them in such a way that the children are fed from his money. But they would humiliate him publicly until he would of his own will start sustaining his children. So the Gemara adds, and we said this law only when he is not wealthy, and he must toil hard to provide food for his children. But if he is wealthy, then yes, we coerce him against his will to sustain them. Like this case of Rava, who coerced Rav Nassan bar Ami, who was a wealthy man, to donate to charity and collected from him 400 dinars for charity. And this shows that even in the absence of a particular obligation, the court will compel a person to give charity if he can afford it. And the same reasoning certainly applies to a man's own children. Here's a halacha. All are obligated to give charity to the poor, period. If someone gives less than the appropriate sum according to his means, you have to give 10% of your money to charity, the court forces him and administers lashes for rebelliousness until he gives the amount they have deemed appropriate for him, right? So that's different than they make him stand out in public and announce about himself that he's unwilling to sustain his children, but they don't seize his assets. But one who doesn't give to charity, they will, right? If he has more than enough money to give to charity, then technically speaking, the court can step in and seize that man's assets or, whip him until he gives money to charity. Rabbi Ilya said that Reish Lakish, and all the more so to sustain his own children, right? So that the town doesn't have to collect charity for those children. So Rabbi Ilya said that Reish Lakish said, in Usha, the sages instituted that in a case of one who writes a document stating that he is giving all his property as a gift to his sons in his lifetime, he and his wife are sustained from the property until their deaths. You would think, what kind of ungrateful kids are receiving as a gift their inheritance while their parents are still alive, and then they are not willing to sustain their parents? But this is like a real world thing that needed to be a ruling needed to be made. So Rabbi Zeir objects to this, and some say this objection was raised by Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. What is the significance of this ruling? After all, the sages said a greater novelty than that. A man's widow is sustained from his property, even if his estate was inherited by his daughter, and therefore belongs to her husband when she's married, right? Her property is owned by her husband. So although the property is comparable to property from the estate that was sold to a third party from which a widow is not entitled to claim her sustenance, except for the amount that was included in her marriage contract, still, in this case, the sages decreed that she can claim her livelihood from her late husband's estate to prevent her from losing out entirely. And with this in mind, is it necessary to state that the man himself and his wife during his lifetime received their sustenance from property that he gave as a gift to his sons? Now, the Gemara provides background on this ruling, as Ravin sent in a letter to Babylonia, with regard to one who died and left a widow and a daughter, his widow is sustained from his property, as this is a stipulation of the ketubah, of the marriage contract. If the daughter who is her father's heir married, the estate is considered usufruct property whose produce belongs to her husband. But even so, the widow is sustained from that property. If the daughter died and her husband inherited from her, Rabbi Yehuda, the son of the sister of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina, said, I was involved in an incident of this kind when this very question came before the sages for a ruling, and they said, even in this case, his widow is sustained from his property. And the Gemara reiterates, with all that said, is it necessary to state that he and his wife are entitled to receive the sustenance from the property that he gave his son? The Gemara responds, the ordinance is necessary, lest you say that it is in that case there with regard to a widow that they instituted this law, as there's no one to toil on her behalf since she is by herself. But here, where the husband is alive, he can toil for himself and for her. He gave all his property to his sons, and they turn out to be jerks, but this guy could still earn. So the ordinance of Usha therefore teaches us that the court does not force him to do so, and they may claim their sustenance from his former property. A dilemma was raised. I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. A dilemma was raised before the scholars. Is the law in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Ilya, or is the law not in accordance with his opinion? And the Gemara answers, come in here as Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Yonasan were standing together, and a certain man approached, bent over, and kissed Rabbi Yonasan on his foot. Rabbi Hanina said to Rabbi Yonasan, what is this? Why does he owe you such a mark of gratitude? And he said to him, this man wrote a document stating that he was giving his property to his sons, and I forced them to feed him, for which he is grateful. And the Gemara interprets this incident in light of the issue at hand. Granted, if you say that this was not according to the law, i.e. the man's sons had the right to refrain from sustaining him, due to that reason, Rabbi Yonasan had to force them to feed their father. But if you say that this is the law, i.e. the man's sons were required to sustain him, why did Rabbi Yonasan need to force them to provide the sustenance of their own accord? The court could have simply requisitioned the necessary amount from the property. And this shows that the law is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Ilya. That's where we're going to leave off today. Now let me start scanning the comments for questions since Nina's away and she cannot pass me King Lear. Very good, Tom, right? The ungrateful children. Okay, can I scan backwards? This is a tangent, but the sages go off on them all the time, says Bill. So, does a chicken count as a bird for that mitzvah about shooing away the mother bird? And I think the answer is no, it does not. It's not domesticated fowl where you would shoo away the mother before taking the egg. I remember looking that up. And right, so Tom, I'm puzzled. How is a mitzvah not enforceable? Isn't that of a higher order than any civil legal obligation? And I think what they're saying is, there are positive mitzvahs in the Torah that you should do, and when you fulfill them, you're fulfilling a positive commandment. But, like shooing away the mother bird, like you're not going to have that. You're not going to be able to fulfill that mitzvah unless you go looking for it. For example, it's a mitzvah to save someone who's drowning. I believe in American civil law, if you see a man drowning and you just walk by and don't try to help him, you're not guilty of murder. You're not going to be prosecuted for anything. You should have been the quote-unquote good Samaritan, but you're not legally obligated to do so. Under Torah law, you are obligated, right? So you have to save that life. You have to do your best to save the life. You don't have to risk your own life to do it, right? It might be heroic to risk your own life. You're not obligated to do that. But if you can save a life without risking your own, you are obligated to do that. That's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. Are you obligated to save a life? No, in the sense that you don't have to go looking. You don't have to, take a job as a lifeguard or become a cardiologist so that you will put yourself in a position on a regular basis where you can save lives, right? It's when the situation comes up that it would be a mitzvah to save the life, and then you're commanded to do so, but you're not obligated to create that scenario. Obligated means that, it's an obligation that rests on everyone who's married, for example. this is the subtlety of it, right? It's a little bit tricky. We're surprised that they're using these words and seemingly, that mitzvahs of this lower order. But I think what they're really saying is an obligation means the court will step in and seize the assets, right? And mitzvah means the father should do it so that he can fulfill the positive commandment, but it's not the court's role to come in and seize the assets unless it's actually an obligation. And just checking the YouTube side. If a woman does not want her vow nullified, can her father or husband nullify her vow against her wishes? If so, what are her options then? Good, right? So good question. Can the father nullify her vow against her wishes? I think maybe yes. I think the way the Torah puts it is on the day he hears of her vow, he can nullify it, right? And he doesn't have to check with her, hey, do you want me to nullify your vow? Like once he hears that she made a vow, he can nullify it. And then if that day passes, then he can no longer nullify it. So there's a time limit on that as well. But generally speaking, in terms of these nedarim, like these vows that people undertake, the sages were against them. There are enough mitzvahs, positive and negative, and even more hardcore obligations. By the way, usually when we say that somebody's chayav or chiyuv, like for example, somebody whose parent dies, right, and it's a man, a Jewish man, he's obligated to say Kaddish for his father, right? That's an obligation. That's not just a mitzvah. And that's where that term is, often used, right? So, but at any rate, but in terms of vows, right, you shouldn't take a vow. Well, when we get to the tractate about vows, we'll see that the sages considered it bad behavior. The Torah says if you make a vow, you have to fulfill it unless the thing you vowed violates Torah law. But if it's within Torah law, the thing you vowed to do, now you have to go do it. And if you don't, it's a sin. And that's why the sages said, why would you take a vow? It's difficult enough to be a frum yid, right? To be an observant Jew and to fulfill the Torah to the best of your ability without adding additional obligations. It would almost violate the commandment, which is definitely a commandment, specific commandment, do not add or detract, right, from these laws that I give you today, says Moses, on behalf of God. So undertaking a vow is, in a sense, adding, and it's considered not sinful, but inappropriate, right? Inappropriate. And so why does the Torah sort of have this special out for women that it doesn't give to men? I think some would say, I think Rashi says elsewhere, because women are more emotional and more apt without thinking it through to undertake a vow. And they spend less time, let's say, in the study hall because they're not obligated to be there, and to realize how much they've put upon themselves. And so God gave them that out, that their father or husband could nullify the vow for them. But if it's not nullified, then they stand in the same position as any man who made that vow. We'll learn a lot more about that when we get to the laws of vows. This is just kind of incidental here about the authority of the father versus the husband. All right, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Thursday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 50 here in Tractate Kesubos. Have a great night.